It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kevin DeLuca, a professor of communication and adjunct professor of both Asian Studies and the Environmental Humanities at the University of Utah. Kevin's work on the role of images in social movements has been a huge influence on a generation of scholars. His book, Image Politics, The New Rhetoric of Environmental Activism, looked at the ways environmental activists were taking advantage of new opportunities to mobilize people without relying on centralized leadership or traditional political venues. The book was a foundational study in the field of visual rhetoric and continues to be widely cited some 20 years later. Kevin's piece with Jennifer Peoples, From Public Sphere to Public Screen, which problematized some key assumptions of public sphere theory through an analysis of the 1999 WTO protests here in Seattle, won NCA's prestigious Golden Monograph Award. His numerous solo and collaborative work since include analyses of Greenpeace, Occupy Wall Street, the BP oil disaster, the rhetoric and imagery of national parks, and, in most recent years, of social activism, environmentalism, and the emerging public sphere in China. Kevin's deep and wide body of knowledge has made a tremendous impact on the fields of environmental rhetoric, social movements, visual culture, and critical theory writ large. As a scholar and as a person, Kevin is irreverent and provocative in the best possible senses of those words. He takes nothing at face value, and he regularly pulls the epistemological rug out from under some of our most sacrosanct assumptions about our politics and our planet. Kevin has been a dear friend and mentor to me personally for over 20 years, which freaks me out a little bit, serving as my master's thesis advisor at Penn State and then later as my faculty colleague at the University of Georgia. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Kevin publicly for his enduring friendship and for the many thought-provoking conversations over the years. I look forward to enjoying many more, starting with this talk today, entitled The Wild Public Screens of China, Activism on Social Media Networks. Please help me welcoming Dr. Kevin DeLuca.
Thanks, Christine, for that gracious introduction. Though it's always bad to hear someone say that you've influenced a generation. It's alarming. I also want to thank Katie and the Colloquium Committee for inviting me, and Christine and Leah for letting me be on their campus. Christine and Leah are two of the most thoughtful rhetorical critics in the field, and they don't need me here just to kind of muck up things. So thank you for letting me do that. And I wanted to give some warnings. If people need to leave now, that's fine. I never take anything personal. Okay, first, this is a book project. So I have a lot to say, and all I have is like an hour. So you will suffer for that. Partly I'll speak quickly. It's not my fault. I'm from New York City, which explains the irreverence. And Matt also called it, Matt, did you say it was uncouth or something better, something nicer? Direct, forward. Right, yeah, that was nicer. But abrasive, uncouth, whatever. So, and I think we speak quickly. I don't know why. And I want to get this whole book in, so I'll try to do that as much as I can. So apologies ahead of time. Also, there'll be too many images, as Christine mentioned. I like doing visuals, and so you can't stop me. Whenever I mention any talk I'm giving, people are like, cut down the visuals by like 50%, and I'll say, okay, only 10 more. And so that's what happens there. Also, this book project was, I did a lot of it with a graduate student, Betsy Bruner, who's at Idaho State now. And so we've published a couple essays out of this, and as a book, both of our names will be on it. So my name only now, but both of ours. And then I was thinking, I should have been here Monday for Earth Day. But then I saw this paper, right? And look how glum this is. Earth Day, happy day, celebrate, be joyful. And also, it's the totally wrong advice, right? Do not recycle. Where does your recycling go? China, Asia, Africa, which they then throw out for you. So very little recycling makes money, so it's a bad idea. So enough of that. Luckily, I'm here for a different national day. Today is National Administrators Day, which is probably like the worst possible day I can imagine honoring. But nonetheless, here we are. Okay, so the wild public screens of China. Hopefully a lot of this title will become self-evident as we go. If not, people can ask me questions. 3 questions motivate this project, right? The first is, how does the emergence of China as an event change how we have to think about the world? I will go over that in some length. That'll be like the first third or so. And by event, I'll also mention what I mean by that. Second, how does the emergence of social media as an event change the possibilities for activism? So too many of you people are a lot younger than I am. So social media has like totally transformed everything. So a lot of people are growing up with it, so it doesn't seem that weird. To me, it's totally bizarre. The only time I'm comfortable is when I'm in China without a smartphone, and life seems normal. Other than that, all the rest of the stuff is strange. Keep that strangeness in mind. And then third, in a global surveillance society, as I'll talk about, made possible in large part by smartphones and this other technology, institutional democracy hampers activism. Okay, that's maybe controversial, maybe not, we'll see. And then do Chinese activists offer a different model for social change? So kind of the third question. Okay, let's go forward. For a long time, China has been kind of this other in the Western imagination. So you see Napoleon. Hey, isn't that a great picture? So that's the picture of the giant Buddha near Hong Kong. So we just got the right angle. I'll take credit for it. Whoops, let me go back one. But it may not have been me. It could have been my partner. She follows me on a lot of these adventures. And even though she's a social scientist, she kind of puts up with this kind of messy misadventures of rhetoricians and cultural studies scholars, right? So as long ago as Napoleon, they're thinking of China in this way. Thoreau and Emerson talk about China quite a bit. And then I was kind of focusing on the French for some reason. There's a lot to say, like, what's his name? Roland Barthes, French critic, goes to China and writes a whole book about it. Never publishes it in his lifetime, but then it got published posthumously. Maybe his relatives needed money, I'm not really sure. But anyway, it was published. But in the order of things, Foucault, at the very beginning in the preface, talks about basically how this passage out of a Chinese encyclopedia set him on the quest of the book, The Order of Things, kind of one of the formative books in kind of critical theory, cultural studies. Now we could read some of these things and they're quite funny, right? Classifying animals by whether they're frenzied or innumerable or et cetera, or belonging to the emperor, right? So kind of a great classification. But the real point is Foucault's point here at the end, right, is the limitation of our own taxonomy, right? The stark impossibility of thinking that because of our own limits, not the Chinese limits, right, but our own limits. But what is it impossible to think, and what kind of impossibility are we faced with here? So if we're facing events that change the world, then how can we think differently outside of the frames we're already bringing to things? This isn't very aesthetically pleasing, by the way. Okay, so thinking from events. So if you think eventally, events interrupt the world, right? Rupture the world and open up possibilities for something new. The something new is not guaranteed. The two people I'm thinking of here, DeLuca talks about this quite a bit, and Badu talks about this quite a bit. So those two folks. And Martin Jacques, who has a really nice book on China, talks about how we're misreading China because we can't get out of our own Western frame, right? So the desire to measure China primarily in terms of Western yardsticks represents an overweening Western hubris. Does it ever? Almost everything represents an overweening Western hubris, but we'll stick to this for now. A belief that the Western experience is universal in all matters of importance. And so what does it mean if we think outside of that Western frame? Okay, and what's happening in China that makes it an event? So I'll go through this as quickly as possible. Sorry. So first is this, right? This kind of collision of hyper-industrialism and urbanization in China going on in the last 30 years, right? Along with kind of this crazy environmental optimism in China. Now, I don't think everyone in China has environmental optimism, but a lot of the environmental groups I talk to are really optimistic. So I spend like half of my interviews with them trying to dissuade them of their optimism. Luckily, I usually fail, but nonetheless, I'm always like, you guys are crazy. There's no reason for optimism. And that's my stance. This talk might be a little bit optimistic, but really, I am not optimistic at all. I'm more like, you know, the characters in like a Murakami novel, and you're stuck at the bottom of the well looking up, and there might be a small shaft of light. That's it, right? This is my tiny shaft of light. Okay, so what does this look like? So China has over 160 cities of over 1 million people. The United States has 10. And a lot of these cities are like 10 million people, right? Like 1 million is not much. Shanghai in 1980, no skyscrapers. Now it has twice as many skyscrapers as New York City. To give you, I won't go through these numbers, but you can just see how big several of these cities are. And then you see this really dramatic change starting in the 1980s with Deng Xiaoping, when he becomes kind of the leader of China, opens up kind of Maoist communism to capitalism. And whatever we want to say about capitalism, it utterly transformed China. And in some ways, really positive. One is you can see GDP, right? So it's just a dramatic shift in less than 30 years, like our lifetimes. And then extreme poverty declined from 60% to 3%, and child mortality from 83% to, well, I didn't say that. It's almost nothing now. There's almost no child mortality. I don't know what the exact number is. Okay, so what does this look like materially? So here's Shanghai, 1990. And I said today, but I'm actually lying. Always assume when people are talking to you, they're lying, right? So that's okay. But in this case, this is probably more like 2015, this picture, because there's a whole nother bigger skyscraper right here. So if you're at the top of this one, you're now looking up at another skyscraper. So that's in a mere 20-year period, that changed. Shenzhen, if anyone's been to Shenzhen, it's near Hong Kong, and it's kind of a tech computer center of China, or at least one of them. And in 1980, that's what it looked like, and then today it looks like this. So there was 25,000 people there in 1980, and now there's 13 million people. So I just want to kind of give a sense of like how kind of astounding these changes are. And I'll get to a couple more of these. And this is one of my favorite photographs, because you have all of this in one moment. This is in Beijing. So Chinese character Chai, tear down. This is an old Hutong area. This is some monstrosity probably built in the 1970s. Everything built in the 1970s should be torn down. Like they should take this sign, put it on that building. And then there's a skyscraper going up right behind. So you kind of get 3 generations in that photograph. Another example, in 2008, China and Barack Obama both said we're going to build high-speed rail all over the country, because that's what we have to do for our global energy future and to be green. And so China then went ahead and did it. Right, and so they now, they spent that much money. We spent, I don't know, we spent over $8 billion. We started off with $8 billion. And now, 10 years later, China has 18,000 miles of high-speed rail across the country. You can get almost everywhere, not everywhere, almost everywhere. And the United States has not as much. And in fact, the new governor of California just stopped the high-speed rail program. So we still have not as much. You can get by walking on the rail from Los Angeles to Bakersfield, but that's it, right? I don't think you can actually take a train, because no one wants to go to Bakersfield, except for maybe Leah, but I don't know. And so that's kind of what the map looks like, very briefly. Okay, it's not all good, right? I don't want to make it as if this huge explosion, right? It's not a moral judgment, this is great. It's very complicated, all sorts of things are going on. One is this, like China's going to build roughly a new coal power plant for the next decade every week or so. So that's how many they're building, planning on building, and so on. So that's a lot of coal. What does that look like in real life? This is the growth of coal consumption by China versus the United States over the last 20 years. Well, they're estimating forward, so 40 years forward. But if you see just the 20 years, you can see where we were relatively even 20 years ago, and now China's more than doubled and will more than quadruple our coal consumption. Okay, so one good offshoot of some of these negative things is the green industry. So China is kind of the world leader in solar panel production and consumption, wind turbine production and consumption. So they are making real efforts, right? People are worried about pollution. People are worried about having a cleaner environment. It also has the world's largest solar power research facility, a leader in patent applications, And I wasn't sure about this. Sometimes it has the world's fastest supercomputer, sometimes not. Sometimes the US, sometimes Japan. It's like changes almost every week. Here you see it's everywhere in China, solar water heaters on top of roofs, even in like medieval villages, still have that. And when I'm in China for like a few months, I come back and I'm like, where are the solar water heaters on the roof, right? Because they're not there. But they're on new buildings. Solar panels are everywhere. So this is a very small village that never was electrified, but they now have kind of electric lights due to solar panels and stuff. So a lot of stuff is going on positively, a lot of stuff negatively. How to respond to China? And I would argue that the United States tends to respond to China not as an event that changes possibilities in the world, but as a threat. I'll give a couple quick examples of this. The LA Times, of course. It's hard to call the LA Times a newspaper anymore, but for this presentation, let's say it is. So come on, they're not, no one in China is going around dressing in gray, right? I mean, maybe I am right now, but usually not, right? And then Martin Jacques again, having been hegemonic for so long, the West has become imprisoned with its own assumptions, unable to see the world outside of those assumptions. And then we can see that there's these teenagers, 16-year-olds take a test. 16-year-olds shouldn't be allowed to do anything, actually. Keep them in a room somewhere, guarded and protected. But anyway, regardless, they let them take this test. And so this is where US finished, and this is where China finished. But it actually isn't China, it's just Shanghai. And actually, Shanghai is the stupidest part of China. Hopefully no one from here is from Shanghai. Good. And I say that because, first of all, that was the only part of China allowed to take the test that year, right? This is like 2 years ago or so. But Shanghai has enough economic clout that they got to get into college from China, you have to take the Gaokao, right? Everyone takes the Gaokao. So that exam kind of determines where you get to go to college and so on. So Shanghai students, they have a lot of distractions, they have a lot of opportunities. We're not doing well on the Gaokao. So they lobbied the government to have a different version of the Gaokao that's just for the Shanghai students. And so I guess the difference is significant enough, right, that rich people will buy an apartment in Shanghai, which is not cheap, so their high school children can take the Gaokao in Shanghai while going to school somewhere else, right? So kind of working that system. Okay, Obama's response. This is what I mean by Cold War discourse. Our generation's Sputnik moment is back. I don't know if that's possible. It's not like the Terminator, but let's just pretend it's possible, right? In the race for the future, America's in danger of falling behind. So thinking of China that way again, the New York Times loves framing China as a threat. I can go through hundreds of front-page New York Times articles like this, right? It's just amazing. I like this one. China grabs West smoke-spewing factories. So we wanted to keep them, but they took them away from us. Bad China. And then we see these different magazine covers. Angry China. China is a threat to the West. So I didn't even have to come up with this idea myself. The Economist did it for me, right? The China threat. Red alert, China's crackdown. And then this one, when Xi Jinping was elected premier of China or appointed premier of China. This is the cover of Time magazine, which is quite stark that way and quite red. I don't know if they would do this to any other world leader in quite that way. And that's not to defend Xi Jinping, who I'm not actually a fan of. It's just to say this is pretty high-level kind of demonization on our part in the United States. Okay, is this one activist in Greenpeace China? She's no longer with Greenpeace China, but she was when we talked, saying, look, China's way more complicated than this kind of demonization and framing of China as threat, and we need to start acknowledging the complexities of China and thinking how we can interact with China outside of the frame of threat. Okay, so China as an event, hopefully people get an idea of that. I'll move to social media. Social media as an event. I like keeping this here for two reasons. One is McLuhan's point, which is a good point. I think McLuhan's terribly read, and he's very dark. Like when everyone says that social media or media makes us into a global village, and everyone's like, that's a good thing. Has anyone ever been to a village? Like, who wants to live in a village, right? There's so much negativity to a village. Like, we just can't assume it's like a good place to be, right? It's a village and heaven are not synonymous. The other point I wanted to make there, Okay, a change in scale or pace or pattern, right? So basically what I want to say here is that everything I talk about, I'll probably be wrong about. If this changes are happening, there's no way I can tell what's happening now. So everything I'm saying now, I'm making up, but by the time we know I'm wrong, we'll all be dead. So it'll be good. We'll have escaped any kind of censure for that. But we could think about that with the invention of the printing press. You could not have understood the implications for society of the printing press within 50 years of the invention of the printing press. It took centuries to understand what would be possible due to the printing press. So we should say the same thing with social media. I shouldn't be able to know 10 years after the invention of WeChat, Weixin, and Twitter what the impact is, right? It's too new for us to know. And it's as more of the darkness of McLuhan, right? He always says every new medium is a trauma. Right? It's an extension, but it's also traumatic. So you don't recover from trauma right away and know what's happening. Though McLuhan unfortunately gives an outsized role to artists. What is with the artists, right? Come on. I think it's the easy out artist. And we could see, by the other thing I wanted to say with this is a lot of people aren't on social media, right? Almost half the world. So we always, because you're in universities, where we are, you're in Seattle, we think the whole world's connected. Not true, right? Keep that in mind. Billions of people are not connected. And this is a really quick timeline, so you can see how crazy and hectic everything is. And I don't think I have a pointer, so this is my pointer. But since I'm kind of making a critique of digital technology, then I can go analog, I guess. And so you can see how recent some of this stuff is. And some of the older stuff, we're only talking like a 20, 25-year period for all of this social media that's transforming the world. So recent stuff that's really impacting us. And if you look at the cognitive stuff, which I'm not going to talk about here, it's completely alarming. Like if you have children, grab their smartphone and hit it with a hammer, right? It's just terrible stuff, right? There's the cognitive stuff, the research on that, nothing, maybe they're wrong, but there's nothing positive about social media for that. Except, I love one guy wrote a book about this. It improves thumb coordination. Steve Johnson wrote that book. Come on, Steve, like how poor were you that week? So like no one needs their thumb coordination improved. Okay, the top sites in China, very briefly, WeChat, we call it in America, Weixin if you're in China, and then QQ, Weibo. WeChat is this crazy platform, I'll mention it in a second, but notice the social media transformation in China. So in the year 2000, roughly 22 million people were online. And now, less than 2 decades later, it's over 800 million people. So complete change. The first time I went to China, I could actually talk to people and practice my really poor Chinese on the metro and stuff, because they had nothing else to do. Now nobody wants to talk to me, because they're connected to their smartphone. So my Chinese went from poor to very poor, sadly. Okay, so there's a whole kind of social media ecology in China. So like people think they miss like Facebook. They don't really miss Facebook, right? There's lots of options. You don't need to be on Facebook necessarily. Or you just buy a VPN and you get on Facebook. This Great Wall of China is as impermeable as the original Great Wall. Okay, so just some comparisons. I just wanted to mention that Weixin, WeChat does all sorts of things. It's so much more advanced than what we have in the United States. Like you could text your friends, you could send pictures, you could send video clips, you can buy a car, you can buy a can of soda. It's just ridiculous. In fact, when I go to buy things with cash, people look at me like I'm archaic, right? Like I rode up on a horse, right? And I was just like throwing gold bullion at them or something. So it's really difficult because I do not have a Weixin account when I'm in China. And then the other thing, China has 9 of the world's top 20 biggest tech companies. And America has 11 others, right? So basically the whole tech world is largely, not completely, largely in those 2 countries. Okay, so social media, we tend to think it's great, except for maybe myself and a few other people. But one of the things it's without a doubt spawned is our global surveillance society. It's what makes it possible. And it's a pretty serious global surveillance society. And the reason I'm going to look at it from an American angle is people always tell me all the time when I talk about activism in China is, well, how can you have activism? It's a communist society. It's a police state. It's horrible. And a lot of that's true, but there's lots of room for activism. And we are misunderstanding things if we think we're not under surveillance. Like we don't keep it in our own mind here, right? So you have Keith Alexander, former NSA director. His motto was collect it all. Great. Where they collect it all, I'll show you a picture in a real quick second, is Utah. Go figure, right? They figure Mormons will not cause them trouble. You have the 5 eyes have inflicted, this is a Snowden quote, upon the world a system of secret pervasive surveillance from which there is no refuge. You cannot not be spied upon, surveilled. They don't look at all your stuff. Don't get paranoid. I don't want to make people like cut off friendships because they're paranoid about surveillance. But if you do something bad, they'll go get it, right? That's what they do. They save it forever. And you have all these crazy things like boundless informant, 100 to 300 billion pieces of info monthly, key score, X-key score, etc. NSA puts spyware on the world's computers, and then all these different programs we don't even know about. My favorite one is egotistical giraffe, which is easily the best name for a program ever. What are they doing over at the NSA that they're coming up with names like this? But anyway, this program, what it does is it tries to actually break Tor. So if you're using Tor to save your communication and keep it unencrypted, egotistical giraffe is after you. Okay, and so here is the picture of Bluffdale, Utah, where the NSA center is collecting all of your information. Beautiful place, evil doings. Not uncommon, right? Beauty and evil go together. So what do we have? We have free speech zones, which is ridiculous. You probably have them on campus here. Do you guys have them on campus? University of Utah, we definitely have them on campus. Patriot Act, which has been renewed all the time. Facebook and AT&T admitting spying for the government. Public space privatized. Local zoning laws used to violate the First Amendment. I always remember that when I read the First Amendment, there's always a little asterisk. First Amendment doesn't count if it violates local zoning laws. What is that? Like Occupy Wall Street was shut down across the whole country on the same weekend on local zoning laws, except for New York City. And why wasn't it shut down in New York City? This is a kind of trick question. Because Zuccotti Park was a private park. So the city could not cite local zoning laws to shut it down. And so the only place that stayed open was there. Then institutions like the University of Utah enforce time, place, and manner restrictions. So if you want to have a protest, you need to go get permission from administrators. It's National Administrator Day, right? So you have to get their permission in order to protest. Why? Did they write the First Amendment? Have they even read the First Amendment? The fact, I hope no one's here as an administrator, the fact that their administrator should disqualify them for ruling on your activism. Okay, so if we're in this situation of a global surveillance society, what are we to do? And I'm suggesting that both democracy, the public sphere, and freedom of speech and assembly are not enough to kind of safeguard activism when we're facing this situation. First of all, we end up in this situation where we have public discussions protected, right? Institutionally protected. Institutionally protected should scare you, right? The very word institution is scary, but institutionally protected is scary. So it leads to, I'm arguing, domestication, free speech zones. For example, this is the free speech zone at the 2004 Democratic National Convention. This is in Boston, the home of liberty. They need a slogan to put that up so we know. The fence is hard, not really telling us that. And of course, it's at the Boston Garden, so you cannot even see the Boston Garden from this free speech zone, or vice versa. So you could protest as much as you wanted, and you would not disturb the peace of any convention goers. This hasn't really gotten better. This is 2012. Has anyone been pepper sprayed? Yeah, like, how are these people taking this stuff? This is pretty serious pepper spray, right? Pepper spray is painful, painful, painful. And then this is the saddest picture I'm going to show you. This disfigurement of mountain bikes into a vehicle of the police state. My goodness, they're mountain bikes. They're supposed to be about freedom. And so, and then RNC, I wanted to be bipartisan. So 2012, also a lot of mountain bikes. How come they have so many mountain bikes for these conventions? It's like, and what do they do with them after they're done? They should like hand them out to people. Occupy Wall Street, look at this brave woman. My goodness. That I cannot imagine. There is no way I could not move from that. It's just unimaginable. And I didn't want Seattle to escape censure. Y'all, what were you doing in 1999? Like, what? Why was this allowed? Oh, I did say something here, right? Okay, so I want to basically say that the idea of the public sphere, the idea that the First Amendment protects us, is not exactly true, right? That we have severe problems. So the answer for China, for example, isn't, why don't you just get a First Amendment and a public sphere? Maybe, but look at all the ways we crack down on ourselves. Okay, demise of the democratic public sphere. Part of it's technological, as people don't gather. They're on their screens all the time. Part of it's this global surveillance society and legal restrictions I was already talking about. And then what happens in China, where they don't think they have these kind of protections? Let's take a look. Okay, first of all, public screens. This is actually the public screen overlooking the bird's nest from the Olympics in Beijing. So it's just a momentary image that they had up there, right? But we see these images everywhere, big cities, but more likely here, right, in our pocket. So this barely fits in my pocket. This is literally called the megaphone. Good name. I don't think they make it anymore, right? But you know, so we're always on these screens, right? Either big public screens or screens in our pockets, et cetera, right? And what do these screens do for us? Well, it becomes a different way of thinking. This is my second saddest photograph. But nowadays, kids are on this stuff so much that it doesn't even look sad. It looks like the norm, right? So I find it sad, but it's really just normal now. So images eclipse words, glances replace the gaze, speed shatters contemplation, immersion erases objectivity, emotion trumps rationality, and distraction erodes focus. Okay, I'm arguing that's what happens. I'm not necessarily saying it's a good thing or bad thing, right? It's just different, right? You end up in a different situation, how people approach things, approach problems, and so on, especially the use of images and speed. So, and then I want to say, in a global surveillance society, all we have, in a way, is domesticated public screens and wild public screens, what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say. And in China, and I think this is a real big advantage for Chinese people. Like when we read the newspaper, if we read the New York Times, we think it's the news instead of propaganda, except for Noam Chomsky, right? Noam Chomsky knows it's propaganda, right? So if you read Manufacturing Consent, right, great. But if you haven't read it, we're thinking we're getting news. In China, there's never the assumption you're getting the news. You always have to read it with a hermeneutics of suspicion. You know that the government wants you to get certain messages. You have to be aware of that. And so in this present state, there's not the assumption that we're somehow, in China, there's not the assumption that you're free and have no problem. So, and now it's been intensified, right? So they have this social credit score starting to happen in China. I guess it's being experimented on in a few cities and will be fully implemented, I guess, by 2020. And it somehow, it impacts things even like your ability to buy plane tickets and something like that, right? So it's a pretty severe thing. However, don't rest comfortable. I guess my only message from today is don't be comfortable. So in the United States, 4 years from now, they expect to have if you're flying on an airport, your face will be scanned. 97% of everyone's face will be scanned if you go to an airport. Of course, the airlines are doing their best to make sure you never go to airports. So you might be safe, right? But other than that. So we're not outside of this global surveillance state. We're part of it. We're in it. Okay, in China, part of the role of the internet, this wild public screen, is lots of times, if certain issues become really popular, they will exceed the capacity of the state to censor things on the internet. As Xiang writes about here, right, the internet plays the role of a massive distribution platform that denies the government its agenda-setting power. One example of this, a brief example, I won't go into it, it's in the book, it's called Under the Dome, and it's about kind of air pollution in China, and it was done by a former newscaster. And she kind of self-financed it and did it, and the government let it be on the internet, right? It was fine because it's about pollution, you're allowed to talk about it. But it became so popular, it had like over 200 million downloads in the first few days, that they then banned it. But by then it was too late, right? It already circulated so much, it was beyond the government's capacity to ban it. And that can happen lots of times, right? Things can be too quick or too subtle. Okay, so pan-mediation. So part of this is part of the good thing, and this is kind of my optimism, and I apologize for any optimism I show, is that the smartphones give us a lot of power. Like they allow us to be news sources in a way that just wasn't possible 25 years ago. Like I wasn't going to be able to shoot a protest and then upload it on the internet and have thousands of people see it in the year 1990. Just impossible. So all my news was coming from mainstream media. And so social media then create pan-mediate people. People freed from protection and armed with smartphones can race and rage across wild public screens and enact changes on local and global scales. And I'll give a couple of examples of that. And in China, we have kind of wild activism, outside of sanctioned activism on these wild public screens. And so in some ways, I'm not saying it's a perfect model for the rest of the world, but it's one possible model. And we'll look at that briefly. Okay, activism in China has, along with everything else, exploded. So they talk about moving from 10,000 to over 180,000 protests. So a lot of activism does happen in China. It's not all clamped down the way we think about it. And a lot of Chinese people are becoming more and more worried about their environment, that they just can't recklessly consume and industrialize without any problem. Okay, Qidong, what was happening in Qidong? Qidong is next to, it's a relatively small fishing of a couple million people, right? So not that small, near Shanghai. So Shanghai's much bigger, but it's a very important fishing port in China, and they get their fish from the Yellow Sea. And the government had approved of a paper factory dumping tens of thousands of gallons of wastewater into the East China Sea. And it was a Japanese paper company on top of it, which amplified all of the protests, by the way. So the Qidong citizens were like, this is not a good idea for us. Like, this isn't a great thing. And so they decided to protest. That's a great picture, huh? Like this guy like protesting against all of these people. But they understood they had to be on social media also. They couldn't just go to the streets. So they went to social media first, and they did stuff like this. So these posters circulated both on the streets and on social media. So WTF obviously means what it obviously means. And I think we're being recorded, so no swear words. And so this poster circulated on social media and also on the streets. People would post these posters on the streets. So it would be both a public thing and kind of on your individual smartphones, et cetera, right? So we have this going on all summer. And we have things like this: no environment, no future. So this is circulating again, social media and streets. So screens and streets. And then protest, OG pollution, Qidong, no environment, no future. Notice all the fish stuff going on, right? Like fish, what's with all the fish, right? First of all, it's a fishing port, right? And second, this is pretty significant because the United States is a pretty mobile society, but if you're in China, you have a residency permit, and you're supposed to be a resident of a certain city, village, et cetera, et cetera. So to switch up that residency permit is not the easiest thing in the world. It's not like you can say, I'm just going to move here and just do it, right? So your sense of localness is pretty strong, right, in lots of ways. And partly officially it's strong, but also like Qidong is fairly isolated. It's a little bit hard to get to. So they feel this connection to both their place and their connection to the ocean and the fish. The other thing is, this is actually kind of a takeoff on a reality eating show in China at the time. So Future Bite in Qidong, I forget the name of the show. It's something like Bite in China. So it was like a reality, we have those reality shows here and stuff. But the importance of food in China can almost not be overstated, right? So a common greeting in Chinese when you meet someone is 吃饭了吗, right? Have you eaten? Like, I've never in the United States walked up to someone and said, have you eaten, right? It's like, it would be pretty odd. People go, no, I haven't eaten. Are you going to buy me lunch now, right? But in China, it's a very common way to greet people, 吃饭了吗, right? So that sense of how important food is. And so this plant was seen as threatening their food source, their fish, right? And so on. Okay, I just wanted to throw in a non-fish picture. So they also like haiyan, seagulls, right? But again, we love Qidong forever. So a protest emphasized on place. And this caught the attention of the government. I wanted to read a couple of these. So the government then sent out messages to all the students. This is in the summertime, right? All the students and the parents of the students. So this was the message to the students. No, parents first. Parents first. Dear parents, after receiving instructions from superiors, we ask that in order to maintain a harmonious and stable environment in Qidong, you do not organize, participate in, support, or stand around to watch the group protests that have no permission from the government. So don't even watch them. I love that part. And then we ask this so you do not suffer any unnecessary harm. We ask that you cooperate. After you receive this, please respond promptly with child's name, name of guardian, acknowledgement, guarantee to not organize, participate in, support, or stand around to watch. We thank you for your understanding of our work. Okay, so that's to the parents in Qidong. So this is just from a social media campaign, nothing on the streets yet. Then all students, we hope that during the summer, you will respect and follow the law, obey traffic regulations, watch out for your personal safety, finish your summer schoolwork. No wonder America gets nothing done. Look at all this stuff people are doing in the summer. With regard to that certain movement organized by society persons, strictly adopt the stance of not being curious. I love that, not being curious, not participating, not supporting, not standing around to watch. Have a cultured, safe, and meaningful summer vacation. Chigway School Administration. And then finally, one more after these weren't working, right? In accordance with the national protest law, the planned protests on July 28th, 29th, and 30th to take place at Qidong's Yonggan Square against the Nantong large-scale wastewater sea pipeline is an illegal protest. Any participation will be punished by the relevant public security law and will impact university entrance. So really serious, right? Like where you get to go to college. And an individual's future. And then you're supposed to pledge an oath to this. I solemnly promise with regards to the July 28th, 29th, 30th illegal protest, I will strictly adopt a stance of not organizing, not participating, not supporting, and not watching. So the social media campaign was really working, right? And really had the authorities scared. And they had good reason to be scared. This was July 28th. So this was the first day of the protest. This is at City Hall. This is like one of my favorite images of all time. And this guy, you can't really tell, probably, the resolution in this is less than desirable. But he's holding up a smartphone, taking photographs and video of the protests. And so what you have here, and I'll read a tiny bit of it in a second, you have kind of the citizens turning the surveillance state inside out, right? So instead of the state surveilling on the citizens have taken all the papers. Could you guys see them floating around there? There's a better one. Have taken all the papers and the information the government has about the people and just throwing it out into the streets, right? In this kind of disemboweling of the bureaucracy. And it was a pretty violent protest. Don't worry, this is not the worst image I will show you. But I will give a warning before the worst image. This was the police, and that's the mayor. So they actually stripped the mayor of his shirt and stuff and tried to put a protest shirt on him. So it was a pretty enthusiastic protest that went on here. Over 10,000 people showed up, and they won within the same day. Two things happened I want to know. One is, like the Wall Street Journal is talking about this protest on the same day that it happened in Qidong. And it's true of The Guardian in England and stuff like that. And also the government agreed at this time period, on that day to stop the whole project, right? So it took one day to end this project. Okay, so Qidong, inside the government office building, inside that bureaucratic behemoth, inside the demos, mob, crowd, multitude, masses are engaging in eviscerating the bureaucratic beast. This evisceration turns things inside out. In the global surveillance state, citizens are transparent to their government while governments are opaque to their citizens. The internet and the many other new surveillance technologies enable governments to render their citizens transparent, but citizens are denied the same possibility. Yeah, on this occasion of rebellious networks connecting, bodies rising, effective winds, inciting flames of violence, an event forces open worlds. Things are askew. Reality is ajar. Inside a bureaucratic office, a young Asian woman stands on a desk. Dressed in the global uniform of youth, pink Nike sneakers, blue jeans, pink hoodie, and white baseball cap, she's standing on a cluttered desk while emptying a filtered water jug onto the papers and books piled on it. Her vertical form splits and dominates the picture, set off by the nondescript white walls and ceiling of the office. The close-cropped picture that places her in the middle ground highlights her actions. Her face is largely obscured by the angle of her baseball cap, though there may be a hint of a smile, which I don't think you can see it on this one. In the background is an open storage cabinet and light from a window. A stamp on the bottom of the photograph identifies the picture as circulating on Weibo. It is a striking photograph. The individual is rising up against the bureaucracy. A person is breaking free of Weber's iron cage. For a moment, a citizen is overturning the hierarchy with the state. Rage and perhaps joy are violating bureaucratic rationality. Chaotic social media are overwhelming the regimented state. Water is drowning information. Force and violence are challenging the reason of global industrial capitalism. The second image echoes the first. We have an image of a bureaucratic office. Doesn't this look like a ton of fun? Like, I would give a lot of money to do this in any bureaucracy, right? Like this, I'll pay $100 for an hour to destroy your office. But anyway, no one's going to do that for me. This one has been thoroughly ransacked. Papers and books are everywhere. Chairs and a desk have been overturned. The rampage continues on the right side of the frame, wherein two women continue to violently deconstruct the office. Both are young Asian women with long black hair. One woman with her face obscured by her hair is bent over, facing toward the smartphone, taking the image as she empties a file cabinet. Slightly behind this woman, and it's interesting like how aware we are of, we're always actors in our own play, right? Like here I am violently destroying stuff while I film myself violently destroying stuff, right? It's kind of wonderful in a way. Slightly behind this woman stands another woman facing the opposite side of the room, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, both of these images, which are only two in a flood of images, a bunch of these images, right, of the protests are striking in ways already mentioned, including citizens challenging the authority of the state, individuals trashing the bureaucratic machine that so often runs their lives and ruins their lives, ordinary citizens violating laws and authorities on behalf of violated water, violated bodies, and a violated environment. New social media empowering people to challenge and defeat traditional power dynamics, ecological interests triumphing over industrial capitalism, lives trumping profit. Okay, that's irrational exuberance. Remember we used to have that about the Wall Street? So I'm just having it for this moment now. Thank you for the indulgence. Okay, and what happened then, just a couple months later, ecological progress became one of the 5 pillars of kind of the Chinese Communist Party when they met. So people were, and this wasn't the only protest, right? There was more than one protest. And so people were paying attention. I wanted to contrast this ever so briefly to Keystone. So Keystone, we spent 5 years having kind of ritualized civil disobedience around the White House. And in fact, Bill McKibben gave out a big letter in Rolling Stone telling people how to civilly get arrested. He wanted no ruckus, no violence, no untoward behavior, no bad manners, no forgetting to address the police as sir and ma'am. I'm kidding about the last line. So this kind of overwhelming civil disobedience as ritual now, basically, performance art. And so it took 5 years before anything happened. And by that time, Obama waited so long, was so not forced, right? So remember, the Qidong protest took 1 day once they did the protest, right? Basically, I guess when you beat up the mayor, something happens. And so this took forever, and Obama waited so long, Obama administration, that Trump just reversed it when he got into office. Like it wasn't done in 2011, it wasn't done in 2012, 2013, 2014, et cetera. Okay, and then it's also, it allows people to get social virtue signaling credibility. I think this is Daryl Hannah here, right? So I was like, I care about the environment. Okay. Environmental NGO, so that's Qidong, and that's kind of one example. I wanted to give a very different example about like actual, not just the citizens or the demos rising up and attacking the state, but what about non-government organizations, which a lot have started coming to China. So the first one, 1994, now there's several thousand in China, both local, national, and international are all there. The group I'm going to talk about is IFAW. And IFAW started in Canada, actually trying to save baby harp seals. Remember, like in the cute little baby harp seals are all white, and then you hit them with a club and they turn red. And so people were like appalled by that result. And so the International Fund for Animal Welfare started, right? Then they moved to America. They're in Cape Cod, so they didn't want to get too close to people, so they're there. And they started looking at a bunch of charismatic megafauna. And elephants are one of their big campaigns, right? One of the biggest things. And the reason they're in China so much, twofold. It's actually kind of an interesting story. One is ivory, right? So why do people shoot elephants in Africa? To sell the tusk for ivory, basically. Right? People don't really eat elephants. And so that's a major thing happening. And a bad picture is coming up soon, which I will mention you because the slide before has red on it as a warning, as if you were like a bull or something. And and then we had a master's student way before I was at the University of Utah who got her degree and started working for IFAW, and she's from China. And then she went on a trip to China, and she was like, oh my goodness, this is an environmental disaster. And she opened an office in China, and then she became the director of IFAW in China and then all of Asia. So it was just kind of this interesting happenstance. So they've been doing this for quite a while. Maybe you have or have not heard of them. And why are they doing this? One is the kind of absolute annihilation of non-human life forms on the planet. So this gives you some sense of what's happened to other things that live on the planet. So you may like your dog or cat or something, but our actions are probably not too friendly to other things on the planet. So WWF talked about this, where basically in my lifetime, 60% of all the other animals swimming in the ocean, in fresh water, on land, and in the air have died. Yikes, without being replaced, right? Like a 60% reduction of, not species, numbers of species, which is a different thing, right? Sixth grade extinction, but actual masses of animals have disappeared. Elephants are a great example of this. As WWF talks about with their Living Planet report, okay, it would be like depopulating North America, South America, Europe, China, and Oceania. What is Oceania? It sounds like it's from George Orwell. I assume it's Australia and New Zealand, right? Or it's a place in 1984. Okay, and most of that is just due to exploitation, i.e. killing elephants for ivory, and habitat loss, like the vast majority. In fact, I'm really tired of all the global warming stuff, because you'll see we're ignoring all this other stuff while we emphasize global warming nonstop. So we will destroy the planet before we have to worry about how hot it is. And you guys never worry about how hot it is. Like the problem is it's not hot enough around here, right? You guys have the opposite issue going on. Oh, wait. See, red, warning. Okay, bad slide if you don't want to look at it. So elephants have gone from 10 million African elephants in 1930 to 400,000 today. So basically a total decimation. And they're not long for this world. And a lot of it has to do with ivory, medicine, and habitat loss. Two tusks, okay, people don't want to look. This is a much happier image. It's not that happy. It's fairly apocalyptic, but in a gentle way. So the tusks are worth a fortune, right? $100,000. So if you're living in Africa and don't have a lot of money, you shoot an elephant, you can get, you're not going to get $100,000 because there's a lot of middle people, right? But you can get a lot of money versus what you might normally get. Okay, so IFAW has this campaign going on in the subways, Beijing, other cities, et cetera, throughout Guangzhou, other places, and so on, right? And the reading basically is like, Mom, I got a tooth, and the mom says nothing. Mom, I got a tooth, the mom says nothing. And then the little elephant says, aren't you happy I got a tooth, right? And then the whole point is the tooth is a tusk, and the mom knows that you might get shot for your tusk, right? So it's kind of this playing on parental emotions and feelings. And it's in the Beijing subway, that's where I saw it, Woduku stop. And just want to emphasize how important the Beijing subway is. So the Beijing subway has 10 million daily riders. So your ad campaign might have a lot of views going on. And in fact, just like the rest of China, the Beijing subway exploded from 32 miles in the year 2001 to 400 miles today, and it'll be up to 600 miles by 2021. So it's a huge, massive system. It's very important to everyday life in Beijing. That's really the only way to get around. It's all gridlocked otherwise, the traffic. And then I wanted to get a sense of the growth, right? So here's the New York City subway, the poor New York City subway. They're trying to finish a 7-mile line called the 2nd Avenue line, and it took them 7 years to do 2 miles. So basically, literally, Beijing's doing it 100 times faster, like 30 miles a year versus 0.3 miles a year. And the bad thing was, like, I read about this. I'm from New York City, right? So I read about this, and everyone was celebrating it. I was like, what are you guys celebrating? It took 7 years to go 2 miles, right? I thought those people should have, should have jumped off the George Washington Bridge, I guess, but they didn't. They're probably promoted. So the other 5 miles, they're still waiting on. No one has any idea when those will finish, right? But so the subway is pretty crucial. This was IFAW's campaign. This campaign became so popular. IFAW is one of the few groups that does pre-test, post-test. And so, oh, darn, I was going to give everyone a treat. Does anyone want a small bite of chocolate? And the reason I'm giving it out, it says endangered species with an elephant on it. It's like perfect. So you could just take a small chunk, but you don't have to. You don't have to feel obligated. It's 88%, so it's actually good for you. Almost no sugar. And really feel free to eat it. I have like 8 more in my hotel, so don't worry about it. So this campaign was so popular that they did a pre-test, first of all, right? And then afterwards, they couldn't do a post-test because so many people had seen it. It was hard to find people that didn't know about it. And then I wanted to mention the word ya. So ya is the word for tooth, but it's also, in Chinese, it's also the word for tusk. Right, so there's no distinction. So when IFAW did an early kind of survey of Chinese people, this is around probably 2009 or so, something like 70% of all the people they surveyed did not know that you had to kill an elephant to get the tusk. Because like, if someone wanted to get my tooth, you don't have to kill me. I mean, you might prefer to kill me, but you don't have to kill me, right? But you're not getting a tusk otherwise, right? So you have to kill them. So people didn't even realize that, right? Because of the kind of language issue there. And then this campaign was in subways, but it's also in social media. So Grace Gabriel, the woman I was talking about who set up IFAW in China, talks about what social media has done for them. This is from an interview roughly like 2015 or so. In the last 2 years, the explosion of social media and interest in animal issues and the way social media can instantly, just overnight, change the situation. Quite often, these kind of animal cruelty atrocities were stopped by social media, by Chinese people directly. So this ability of Chinese media to get around any official kind of media control, right? And then this is another poster, and this is what it says, right? An elephant without a tooth, a tiger without a bone. Xiang, oh wait, I want to tell you my favorite Chinese word. Xiang, up top there, my favorite Chinese word of all time. What it means in the language is imagine, right? To imagine something, xiang. But it literally means think elephant. Isn't that great? It's like, to think of an elephant is to imagine, right? Because the elephant, when you think about it, it's a pretty crazy creature, right? How does this thing even exist? So anyway, sorry, go forward. An elephant without a tooth, a tiger without a bone, a bear without a gallbladder, and a person without humanity. So they took out part of the character for each of these, right? Xiang, Hua, Xiong. So they took out part of the character and put blood splatter in its place, right, to emphasize what's happening with the poaching of these animals. And then with the human character, Ren, right, they took away one of the legs, basically, right? Like you're losing your humanity by using these illegally poached animals, et cetera, et cetera. So this was also in the subways throughout. And this campaign worked in lots of ways. Also, they're depending on their citizens to take pictures of these images and share them on WeChat and Weixin and Weibo and so on, right? So one of the directors, or one of the communications director actually of IFAW in China, says, the evolving social media strategy, a much wider media engagement from the perspective of the individual. So this is a sense of how much power we all have because of smartphones. Individuals, that everybody is a source of media, a source of content. So we're thinking this is what it means by everybody has the equivalent power, the equal power of speaking. So, and in 2018, China officially banned ivory. So there's still a black market to some extent, but officially you're not allowed to trade in ivory in China anymore. So, and they burned a bunch of ivory, you know, those big burning piles of ivory that several countries have done. In Hong Kong, US has done it. I think we did it in Denver, and then China's also done it. Okay, conclusions. What can we think about all this? This photograph has nothing to do with anything except I like it, right? So it's random. But a lot of images are random, right? One is social media foster a norm of perpetual participation, which we can see in Chinese activism, Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, and so on. That we're supposed to, as citizens, not listen and get information, but be out there, right? Produce information, engage. And this, again, is me being very optimistic. The norm creates new expectations of what it means to be a citizen and a democracy. Like, voting's not enough, right? You just can't vote and go home. And then finally, people become decentered knots of news across a vast array of millions of public screens. And most of us don't access all those screens, but it's possible, right? It's a possibility, and many people have succeeded in doing that. Okay, I'm not crazily optimistic, so I think Chinese citizens are doing something different. I think the Chinese government, by the way, is cracking down on a lot of stuff in the last 2 years. So I'm not a wild-eyed optimist. But in a global surveillance state, what can we do? That's not officially approved, right? Is a question. And so still the world is balancing on a nice edge. So I don't have this like, things are great, things are going to be fantastic 15 years from now. Probably not. I think like the events of both China and the impact China's having on the world and social media are likely to produce really dangerous times, as well as maybe possibilities for something different. And what is a presentation on China without a panda? But I couldn't stand doing those normal cute pandas, so I did this guy who's just hanging out in a tree. Thanks. If anyone has any questions, I'll answer a question. Matt.
So thanks for this. I have a question that's not, well, so at the very beginning you were talking about how China has been used in the past to problematize categories. So I have a question that's not precisely about any of the sort of specifics that you talked about here, but if it's about problematizing categories, I'm curious, as someone who studies the environment and also as a rhetorician, what you think of the Green New Deal as a rhetorical concept.
I mean, not much. And the reason I would say this, to me, I mean, it's a rhetorical concept, I guess, right? But I don't think it's really going to go very far. And I mean, I think it's good to have a debate about these kind of issues. But I think as soon as anyone pays attention to the math, it's completely unfeasible in terms of the idea that you're going to supply energy to people in the world through wind farms and solar panels. Highly, highly unlikely anytime in the next ensuing decades, like not just in the next 5 years, right? So even China, like I gave you that, you know, all this stuff about wind turbines, solar power and stuff, over 60% of their energy is coming from thermal sources, i.e. gas, oil, and coal, mostly coal still. So even with doing all of that, it's so hard. And the other problem with this is we think about like solar power and windmills coming from like the Keebler elf, right? But they don't, right? Like they take enormous resources to build. And so a lot of people who've done the math on this say wind powers are just are net no gain either way, because they have a lifespan. Their lifespan's about 20 years. And they're gigantic. They're like, the blades are over 100 feet long, right? So there's a lot of resources that go into building them and then go into maintaining them and then dismantling them and transporting them, right? So it's a real problem. So any of the stuff I read about it outside of like the mainstream press says, you know, the math doesn't work. And then they kill a lot of stuff. Like, so for example, the #1 killer of birds is what?
Planes.
Does anyone read anything about the environment in this room? Well, I'm glad you came to this talk. No, cats, by far, they kill billions of birds, right? However, the bright side, if you have a cat that's busy killing birds right now while you're here, the bright side is they kill birds that, mostly birds that we have a lot of. Sparrows, chickadees, whatever, right? They don't kill like eagles or hawks. In fact, it works the other way. Eagles kill cats, right? But what does kill eagles and hawks? Wind turbines. So basically 10%, like one wind turbine farm, it's either in California or Colorado, killed 10% of the golden eagle population in the country. Because they have no way of making sense of these things. Like it's ecologically, these things make no sense. And so they fly into them. The blades are going 100 miles an hour and they're 100 feet long. And they just slaughter these things, right? So some people think several of these raptors will go extinct because of wind farms. And then solar panel things are like that too. Has anyone driven from like Las Vegas to Los Angeles? And there's a huge solar thing. The temperature inside that array is several hundred degrees. And so they call birds smokers, because if a bird flies through that, they just turn into smoke, literally, because it's so hot. So anyway, the whole point is that this is, so the estimate I have for solar panels is you'd have to cover all of California and all of Texas with solar panels to have enough energy for the United States. And that would not include how much energy you would lose by transporting it from California Texas to like Minnesota, who really needs it, right? Or North Dakota. So I'm not that optimistic about it. And I guess then my problem, in the end, and I'm fairly pessimistic anyway, is that we're wildly solipsistic. We care about us. So what are we going to change? So I'm an environmentalist, right? Yeah, sure, I'm an environmentalist. I flew all the way here to talk to you for an hour. What kind of environmentalist is that, right? And then I'll go to my hotel and I'll take a hot shower. What kind of environmentalist is that? Half the world never has hot showers. No one had a hot shower 100 years ago, and I don't want to give up hot showers to help the planet, right? And I don't want to give up my smartphone, though this is like 7 years old. So the average American replaces their smartphone every year. Where are we building this smartphone? Where do we have to go to get this stuff in here? Precious metals and minerals from China, by the way, and Africa. So this thing is like as toxic as it could possibly be. Anything that you're holding, this thing's super toxic. None of us had one 15 years ago, and we didn't care. Our life was fine. And now we think it's worth destroying the planet over, right? So that kind of stuff, metaphorically, as a rhetorical strategy, perhaps. But thanks for the question. Sure.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments.
Sure.
In terms of the global surveillance that you're talking about, China and US, I think there are some level they are the same. I think you quite rightly point out. But by doing so, you seem to also conflate that there are some fundamental differences.
Sure.
There are some really, the stuff they talk about, the IFAW, obviously is very minor. And Chinese protesters have done some success in doing some of these things. That's true. So, but if you get down to some of the more fundamental political side, obviously there's a huge difference.
Right.
Nobel Prize winner is died in Chinese prison, the peace one, a couple of years ago. Obviously, this is not going to happen in this country.
Right.
That will not happen in this country.
Well, I mean, Edward Snowden is under arrest, and we want to extradite him and throw him in prison for 20 years. However, it's rarer. I would certainly agree with that.
And my second comment is that while China has done a lot of things that's really truly number one in the world, and that's quite true. Unfortunately, the couple of examples they pick, I think they are actually quite misinterpreted. This happened to be an area that I have done research on, and I teach classes here for many years. There's the one that I want to point out is the city size. There are a lot of misunderstanding, and you just simply take the face value. For example, there's some city that show up 40-some million, which is totally nonsense in some way. Because people just misinterpreted all the boundary and all the things right there. I've been writing on this subject for a while. The other example, unfortunately, is also pizza. Pizza is so highly misinterpreted. I wrote an op-ed on Seattle Times on this subject a few years ago when this came out. And I spent quite some time last year actually in Shanghai studying educational migrants. Migrants are, because how they get this number? Because migrants are totally excluded in the education system. So they were able to take the cream and do the test. And there are a lot of problems with all that sort of thing. And that's been published, in several papers on this subject. But unfortunately, you haven't really go to read those and just take some of these more some media kind of, Obama said about this stopping moment kind of thing, which it's quite misleading, unfortunately.
Right. Oh, I think two things super quickly. One is there's other educational measures too. I mean, every educational measure will be problematic in some level, even in the United States or any country, right? And for example, some countries that tend to do really well on it are very small and homogeneous. Right?
Actually, the issue is not exactly that. The issue is that when this test, the PISA was done, it is done at the age of 15. In Shanghai, when you come to age 15, all the migrant kids, Shanghai has tons of migrant population, almost like 40%. Their kids were not allowed to go to high school. So that's why basically, so you're just testing the other half. Okay, you're just testing the other half. So it's a totally distorted.
Well, I mean, in some ways it is, but in some ways it isn't, because a lot of countries, people go into a vocational track, and so they wouldn't be tested either, right? And so that would be the lower end too. But there's other measures too of educational measures where China's doing pretty well, and I think there's other points where China's doing well too. So, and including like sending students to be graduate students in America, right? I mean, these aren't terrible students that get to come to Harvard, MIT, and so on, right? So the system has some amount of success. And there was another slide I was going to show, but I wasn't going to have a whole debate on education. that was completely different from the piece that was measuring it, but I didn't bring that here. But what was the first question? I wanted to mention something about the first question, the first point you made.
Oh, I mean, the first one was that there's some fundamental difference between, when you talk
Yeah. So I mean, I would certainly agree with that, right? In lots of ways, right? But for me, part of the issue is that I think people in China are more aware of it, and I think people in the United States think they have a lot of freedom. We have a lot of freedom as long as we're within certain bounds. If you do what Edward Snowden did, you have zero freedom, right? So you have to, or actually Snowden's buddy, who was also arrested in South America when Snowden was taken out of the embassy. Right, so yeah, you have a lot of freedom, and I think more freedom. I would certainly agree with that. And the social credit score thing, I think, is very mortifying. But we also have freedom because we agree to act within a certain boundary. And once we violate that boundary, bets become off a little bit. But I would say it's not as dire. Like, I would say that I would say I'd rather be outrageous in America than in China, right? And it's easy for me to say that, and I'm happy to say that, right? However, I think I could, if I try hard enough, I could get in trouble. No, I think there is a qualitative difference. I think at times the First Amendment can help you. At times the Fourth Amendment can help you. But then it seems to me like the Fourth Amendment's violated all the time, like the search and seizure stuff, right? Especially electronically, and it is violated. Whenever you cause enough trouble for them to violate it, they do. But anyway, that's a long debate, but I think your points are well taken. I'm sorry, Leah or Justin?
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
I was going to ask for you to unpack the difference between because you went through it so quickly. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the difference between what makes a wild public wild.
Right. I would say, and partly because you're not acting on the presumption of protections. Right, so in the United States, if we organize a protest, we're assuming, and not always correctly, right, and it doesn't always happen that way, that we won't be the subject of police violence, that we won't have our First Amendment rights violated, et cetera, right? So we kind of make that assumption, right? While in China, as was kind of just suggested again, right, is that you can't make that assumption. You would actually assume that there's a good chance that you would, that police might violently put down your protest, right? That you wouldn't have to be able to say legally, hey, I can protest, I'm going to ignore you, police. Like, you're not in that situation, and that the legal repercussions are likely to be more severe without any possible legal protections. Like, it is easier to end up in jail in China and never come out, right? Without a doubt, it's easier to do that, right? And so in that sense, you're willing to act, you're willing to do these politics while knowing the consequences are very severe, as opposed to knowing you have a range of possibility. Like, Bill McKibben knows when he got arrested at the White House that they were going to fingerprint him and after 5 hours let him go. Now, he wrote a whole story in the Rolling Stone about how torturous it was and how horrible it was and so on, but really he was uncomfortable for like 12 hours or 8 hours, however long it was, right? So that's a big distinction, as opposed to us never seeing Bill McKibben for the next 3 months, and who knows what happens after that.
So the wildness is specific without right or guarantee.
Right, without institutional protections. That you're willing to still, I mean, in some ways, to me, the actions are just, incredibly brave. Like, but still, like, I mean, I thought the Seattle picture I showed, the Occupy Wall Street, those are very brave actions also, right? And there are consequences, especially in the age of social media. Like that woman's picture, if somehow that's identified as her and she goes to apply for a job and people do a social media search, they might be like, oh, she's a woman that goes out and protests and gets pepper sprayed. She might not get that job, right? So there's still, I don't want to say, obviously I don't want to say the United States is perfect on this, but I want to say that the actual institutional protections in the United States are much stronger than what you have in China. Right? Yeah. Here and then maybe Leah, sorry.
Sort of on that question, do you think this sort of idea of a wild public sphere has any sort of relevance to people within the US who maybe don't have those guarantees of protections, particularly undocumented folks who may not have access even to the same, they might have screens but not streets, right? Given the way that immigration enforcement is happening now. So, like, do you think that there is like activism that folks do on social media who are undocumented, would that be sort of intelligible under this framework of a wild public sphere, or like what would that relationship be?
I mean, yeah, it's a good point. And I would say, both kind of legal status is significant, race is significant, right, in terms of how people get treated and stuff like that. Also, so in a way, what I'm suggesting, even if I'm willing to acknowledge a qualitative difference between the dangers of protesting in China versus protesting in the United States, I'm suggesting in a way that we're all moving toward kind of this global surveillance state where it's pretty much dangerous for a lot of people. The dangers show up in different ways, but like notice when people do something horrible in the United States, like shoot something up or something, we find out all about this person within like 8 hours because we already have all their information. They just have to go get it, right? You know, so yeah, as long as you don't do something horrible, but who knows at what point would it be that what's defined as horrible? Right? Yeah, shooting up things are obviously horrible, right? But as you're suggesting here, if you're here and you're considered an illegal immigrant or whatever, and you've been here even a long time, you know, your ability to protest. I mean, some people have protested a lot that way and tried to protect themselves that way, but other people surely are not protesting because they're afraid of losing their job or losing some grant or getting deported, right? You know, so. Or just getting jailed and then having to wait however that process would work out. So yeah, without a doubt, for people in different categories of availability, and part of it's just even wealth, right? Like I think a lot, I'm not rich. If anyone wants to change the status, feel free. But I have more money than I did when I was 25, right? So the idea of 25, of getting arrested at a protest and going to jail and having to cover a $300 bail was like impossible. Like that would have been like, I'm sitting in jail for 3 weeks, missing my job, getting fired, right? Versus now, okay, I'll pay a $300 bail, get out, bond, whatever you have to pay, and go back later, right? You know, so without a doubt, there's kind of different niches or different categories or possibilities for people depending on circumstances. And certainly wealth is one, but certainly status is a huge one, you know, obviously. And then race is a pretty big one, right? You know, so you can see that, how that works. I'm sorry, Leah?
I was just really interested in the image you showed us of the destruction of the paper.
Mm-hmm.
And in the context of this idea of institutional consequences and sort of in the wild public sphere, you've got, you know the consequences are greater, both for you, but also possibly for the consequences of the protest to the state are higher, right? Because in these cases of protests actually resulted in some action because of that wildness, that fright. But paper, are records really stored in paper there? I mean, I think of paper,
well, I would say
that's sort of the old technology. Aren't these records all digital? If you destroy the paper, it's still there in the server, right?
not always, actually. So it's pretty surprising. So there's a lot of records that are just paper and would not be stored, and so they're actually destroying it. But what I should have mentioned, which I didn't mention here, like the reason that they're overturning it, I think part of it is just like kind of this rage, but part of it is to expose corruption. Right? So it's not so much like destroying the paper, but I probably could have showed it on these images, but like they were taking like cartons of cigarettes, liquor, and condoms and throwing those overboard, right? All those were seen as sources of bribes, forms of bribes, right? And some, expensive liquors, cigarettes, et cetera, et cetera. So the papers were being thrown out, the cigarettes were being thrown out, the liquor was being thrown out. So they were, in a way, kind of a mass exposure of kind of everyday corruption among Chinese government officials. So the paper plays a part, and it could actually be the entire record, actually. So partly, and I didn't really emphasize it enough, right? But China's 1.4 billion people roughly, right? And so I was saying 700 million people have achieved like this whatever state we want to say, middle classness or whatever. 700 million people have not, right? So there's a lot of towns you can go to that are really poor, and you just can't assume things like computers around at all, in the schools, in the government office, et cetera, et cetera. But it would vary widely. Qidong, I doubt they're that poor. I just don't know. It's a good question there. Did they actually have a computer? But I'm sure they have now.
I mean, it's still be effective as a symbolic.
Yeah, right.
That was a few years ago. This is like 2012.
Yeah,
I mean,
2012.
they were not digitizing all this. I mean, it's only recently.
Yeah,
last couple of years they were doing more. This is
Yeah,
this is very common.
Right, it's pretty haphazard, yeah.
This is very common. This is
yeah.
paper.
Yeah. It's there and there and there.
I was curious about it seemed like you mentioned images over text as something that was related to the social media era.
Right.
It seemed like some of the examples you used were like image plus text, and that like some of the activist posters required text as a narrative in order to sort of get going. So I'm curious, like it seems like especially with social media use today, like text just can't seem to go away. Like it seems like it's despite we like using platforms that seem to be so image based, like Snapchat or Instagram, like at least for the United States context, like text like is just like sticks around, keeps coming back, even when it seems like it's not wanted. And I'm curious, like where like why image over text as opposed like why that dichotomy?
Right. Well, I would say first of all, I'm just a polemicist. So in this case, I'm a polemicist on the side of images, right? Largely because I think they're ignored in terms of how they move people, or had been ignored. So as Christine was suggesting, this is 20 years ago. So really, I'm just like replaying the same record over and over again, and someone should just tell me stop. No one uses records anymore. But that's part of it. But the other part, I would say, and so I would say they often go together. But even like if we give this example of like the elephant mom and the elephant baby, right? That text is not particularly like rational, fact-based the way we may think of text from like 50 years ago or 60 years ago, right? Instead, it's an emotional story tied into the image, right? So the image in a way is driving it, the words are reinforcing it, but they're not like, I used the example, I was talking to some people today of car advertising. So if you look at car advertising from the 1920s, there's like a really bad sketch of a car and like words and words all over the place, right? How much horsepower, how to change this, how to do this, how to do that, right? You look at a car image today, it's like the car is hugging a redwood tree. And that's it. You don't know how fast it can go. You don't know its miles per gallon. You don't know its horsepower. Like, I don't even know if anyone's ever told me the horsepower of a car in the last decade, right? It's just like, it's not even a thing. And so, like, I was thinking of an ad I saw at this hotel I'm in for the Telluride. Right? So you're supposed to buy this SUV because the name is Telluride and what that evokes in you from past whatever, right? So it becomes very image-based. We still have words. We still have the word Telluride, for example, right? And so I would certainly agree with your point in the sense that we're not going to get rid of words where it's just purely image-based. Like that's very unlikely to happen. But that the words are kind of, in a way, being driven by the images often. Not always, by the way, but often. So like IFAW doesn't give you stats on the elephant decimation on the subway poster. They don't say, hey, in 1930 there was 100 million elephants and now there's 400,000. You have to go somewhere else to get that stuff, right? So in a way, it's light on kind of the information words can give you, heavy on the image. Of course, the image is a lot bigger and so on. But I'd say part of it is the idea that our dominant mode of perception nowadays is distraction as opposed to focus. So if you're reading something, you're focused. You have to be focused. Images you can just take in a second. Like I showed that elephant image. You guys knew it was two elephants walking into the sunset as soon as you saw it. Like you didn't have to read it. You don't have to think about it, right? And so in an age of distraction where you're looking at your phone, there's images all over the place, right? It's hard to get people to stop and then read a paragraph about something, right? And that's why advertising rarely asks you to read a paragraph about something. Instead, it's image. Like McDonald's doesn't sell you hamburgers because they taste so great and they're made out of such great beef. Instead, they sell you hamburgers because they say you're a bad parent, but you could have good experiences with your child at McDonald's. Right? In other words, an imagistic argument instead of a kind of factual, rational, information-based argument. But you're certainly right. They're always together. So whenever I emphasize images, I'm kind of unfairly doing that. I think that's, so it's a good point. Yes.
It's a simple question, but it has two parts to it. So the first part is, I'm not sure I agree with you on the question of boundaries. When you're saying we're working within certain boundaries, therefore those are the boundaries of protest. I would argue that protest is by definition about bumping against those boundaries and showing everybody that the boundaries are there. So Snowden is a good example because Snowden also knew what he was up against, and the idea was, okay, now you'll see what happens to me, right? And if nothing happened to him, the point would have been moot, right? So it seems like the idea of protest is precisely showing where boundaries are. Now going to social media, and there I have a very simple question. So to what extent can social media and how in social media work as that exposer of boundaries, and to what, well, and the possible aster's question related to that is to what extent protest is just is counterproductive in the sense that, as you say, then this woman will be forever and ever in image banks, so that it will hinder her from any future protest.
Right. Yeah. The first, I would say, yeah, there's a range of protests, right? So a lot of environmental protests, I guess, I think have become too tame, right? So Snowden wasn't too tame, but also he knew he was then going to be in exile or in jail, right? And Chelsea Manning would be another example of that also, right? And then, so McKibben is like, they're not pushing the boundaries. That's why nothing moved in a sense, right? But then you could say Black Lives Matter was working at pushing boundaries, right? And so there seemed to be a lot more consequences to what happened there. So that's a lot to unpack. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think part of the problem with social media, and I think why I was pointing out all this kind of global surveillance state is, like, Facebook is not your friend. Like, I know they have a friend function on there, right? Don't they? Like, you can friend people, unfriend people, whatever. But they're not your friend, right? And so when they need to work with the government, they will, right? When they need to censor things, they will. They're not like we're a bastion of the First Amendment, activism, whatever, right? They're a large corporation in its. In fact, Zuckerberg was just in DC like 2 weeks ago asking for the government to censor social media more. Literally saying, you need to censor social media more. Right? You know, so instead of it being this open platform that maybe the public square once was, maybe I could be idealizing it, I agree that the social media kind of open square has become very dangerous. And the ability to get crushed there, even for minor infractions, is pretty severe, right? Like people lose like future jobs because they used to drink beer in college and post Instagram posts or something, right? You know, and people check on that kind of stuff. It's like, first of all, when did beer drinking become illegal in America? And second, this like inability to kind of allow this openness of platform, right? That, and a whole host of things, horrible things, right? As Chomsky says, Greenwald says, right? The only speech you need protection for is horrible speech. Like, you don't need protection for cat videos on YouTube. No one's going to object. I'm going to object to that, but no one's going to pay attention to me, right? Because the cats are busy out there killing all the birds. But no one else is going to object to that, right? But you know, the horrible groups out there saying stuff, and even groups that we may like that other people think are horrible, need protection, right? Or groups that I mean, that was the famous like Skokie, Illinois decision from 1967, right? The Nazis, the Supreme Court said the Nazis can march down the streets of Skokie, Illinois, which is a Jewish suburb. Why? Because we have a First Amendment. And I think in the social media platform, that's just completely gone. Like, no one thinks that's okay, right? That used to be like a point of pride in like our history textbooks. Look at our First Amendment's so strong, we will allow this, right? Because the Nazis are the ones that no one wants to speak, or no one wants to speak, and so they're the ones that actually need protection, not my right to say that, you know, I don't know, isn't some sports team is great. We don't need that. I'm sorry, question in the back, yeah.
Right. So thank you again for the presentation. It's an area I'm really interested in on multiple levels. So you mentioned that there's the green mindset, and I actually recall experiencing that in China. Whenever I'm there, you flush the toilet with the gray water coming off of the shower. However, there's all of this waste, right? Whether it's the rare earth metals that you discussed, there's the waste that we're sending them, and there's just general litter. So how can these images coexist? And along a similar vein, you mentioned not having a Weixin in town, and Tencent evolved into WeChat, aka Weixin. In modern day China, it's becoming actually problematic, where you can go to venues and restaurants that won't accept cash. They require that account. So how is it that this idea that a government-controlled social media platform is required to live in that country changes the idea of whether or not an alternate public even can exist?
Right.
And then with both of these, right, one is suggesting that society is coming together and kind of not talking about how that same society has all these entirely contrary opinions and ideas. And then on the other hand, we're looking at two societies that have pervasive surveillance, but with that pervasive surveillance, one has said, okay, you may have that data, but we're going to put certain protections and certain stuff gaps. Whereas the other one, it's just like, well, you have that surveillance.
Right.
Yeah. So how do you see these?
Sure. Partly my clip about from that Greenpeace activist about China is that it is wildly diverse, right? So you have these really green programs going on with solar panels, wind turbines, blah, 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 while they're building a coal plant every week, right? That's not so great, you know? So it's 50 coal plants a year, right? So you could put up a lot of wind turbines and still not compensate for that. And then pollution's all over the place, et cetera, et cetera. I would say, and the comment earlier kind of addresses this, that environment, it's not in any way that the environment in China is pristine, but it's an area where you're allowed to be an activist, right? Versus like you cannot be an activist over Tibetan freedom. Like it's just not going to be allowed, right? So just like, but the United States did the same thing in the early 70s, right? Richard Nixon's president, you have the Vietnam War going on, you have the student protests, right? And so what did Nixon administration think? Environmental issues, let's just let that be an open area of protest. And so what did we get? We got the Clean Water Act, we got the Clean Air Act, we got the EPA, and we got Earth Day. Like all those things happened under Nixon at a time of a lot of protests, and it's like, here, why don't you guys protest in the environment? And so I think, in a way, there is some room for environmental protests. Some are okay, some are not okay. I also think, though, partly we always have to think of Chinese government as tiered, right? In other words, like the Chinese government in Beijing might be like, yeah, we don't care about environmental protests, but the government in Qidong might be like, we don't want an environmental protest, right? So you have conflicting kind of powers deciding what can happen, what cannot happen. So it always ends up being complicated. And in this case, I'm sure at one point the Chinese government just goes to Qidong and says, look, you guys just got to acquiesce on this point, right? And yeah, you're going to lose money from this factory, whatever. Too bad, right? Because we cannot have this kind of social unrest. So you probably have governments at different levels of government at odds, right? And people don't think, you know, like if you go into Yunnan province, you're so far away from Beijing, who cares what's happening in Beijing? Right? It's like, yeah, Beijing, you know, it's this kind of dictatorship, blah, blah, blah. But when you're in Yunnan province, it's like, yeah, kind of, but it's so far away, it feels very different than if you're in Beijing, right? And what happens and so on. So I think that those contradictory things happening at the same time, yeah, it's going to happen, especially in a country with 1.4 billion people, a whole bunch of different languages. As you know, you can't even go across China and speak Putonghua and all the way through, right? Oh, you can, but no one's going to understand you after you go a certain distance. If they're older people, if they're younger people, they'll understand you. But you know, anyone over 50, say, you'd be better off speaking Russian. Sorry, second point. I totally forgot it. I was rambling on the first point.
Just this idea.
The global surveillance.
The global surveillance, but being able to live in a country where the social media is owned by the government and required to live in that country. Yeah.
So basically, yeah, I would say two things, maybe. The first is control is never complete. It just isn't. Like, so you want to say you're going to censor the media or social media, and it's a government owned, they still can't censor it all the time. One of the things they do in Chinese, right, is they use homonyms since you have the same different characters with the same thing spoken. So they do it all the time. So then it becomes really hard to censor. Another thing hard to censor actually is images. So they'll use images a lot because they're way harder to censor than words. So you'll ban a certain word that means something bad. So they'll just come up with another word, right, that's a homonym of that word. So everyone will know what you're saying. And so there's all these ways to play with it. So there's some play in the system would be the first point. The second point is the Chinese government has actually realized, and this is good and bad, that it's good for them to let some protest happen. So they let it happen. And then they just don't want it to mass over a certain point. In other words, they don't want it to reach a tipping point. And so there is play in the system itself, partly because then the Chinese government can understand what the people care about. Like, what are you protesting about? Like, how do we know? Since you don't have kind of Well, any government has to figure out what do the people want and know. And so one of the ways they're figuring out what issues become really big on social media, right? And they'll let them get, some things they won't, like the Dalai Lama and Tibet, no, forget about that, right? But other issues they'll let get to a certain point. Then if it reaches a certain tipping point, they may ban it, like under the dome. They're like, okay, that's too big, we'll stop it. So there is play even built into the system because it benefits the government, but then it also benefits activists, enabling them to do their activism, because that play benefits the central government, but it doesn't necessarily benefit the Shanghai city government. And so then the Shanghai city government might be kind of pissed off that activism is allowed to happen at a certain level, while the central government says it's okay, because we want some of that. I'm sorry, you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I guess my kind of concern here is that someone is going to become an activist and then have their social media cut off and now can't buy a loaf of bread, right?
Let's hold it for 1 second. So we're 5 after, maybe we can let people who want to go feel free to slip out, and otherwise we can stay and continue.
Yeah, your concern is completely warranted. What have I said that shouldn't make you concerned? You should be completely concerned, right? It's very dangerous. We're bouncing on a nice edge. And yes, to me, the outcome is likely to be apocalyptic, dystopian versus positive, right? So I'm giving some right possibilities, but I'm not that optimistic. Because the social credit score is a huge concern. The idea that, right, you have to use Weixin to do anything now, right? That's like, wow, that's super convenient, but super convenience comes with a huge cost, right? And we're doing that all the time, right? Like we're saying, okay, Facebook, surveil us all the time, take our person down and sell us because we find your platform convenient. Okay, but at some point that might become a real problem.
I'm going to say thank you, then we can stick around.
Yeah,
That's right. Yeah, thank you.
Not at all, yeah. Where am I going? I can't even go anywhere. I have a hotel room. How much fun is that?
So I think my question's been mostly answered, but
Okay.
you started admitting that there is the small ray of hope that you see, but what do you think the natural endpoint is going to be in terms of censorship? Because for everybody, technology won't keep keeping up, and at some point, things like homonyms, they might just undo the homonyms and
Right.
and whatnot.
Yeah.
What do you think the natural endpoint is? Do you think, because China does not have a First Amendment.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think in the future, I think for all of us, including China, but also including here, it's pretty dire, right? The technology of surveillance, just think of people talk about this all the time, under the old Soviet Union, surveillance was limited because it was just too expensive. You had to hire 5 people just to surveil one person 24 hours a day, right? Because you had to have shifts and follow them, blah, blah, blah. You don't have to do any of that stuff anymore. The little RFID chip in your phone or something just follows you around wherever you're going, right? You're bouncing off of cell phone towers, right? They can check your social media, and it's inexpensive. It's super inexpensive, right? So things are pretty dire. But I also think what makes things unfortunately bleak in the future, the only thing that consoles me is I'm a lot older than you. So if I get to watch it, I get to watch this apocalyptic scene unfold without having to live in it for 3 decades, right? So sorry, condolences. But the other thing is people give up that stuff. The sense of privacy that I value, people who are 20 don't care about. And you might think I'm being harsh. I tried to fill out a Facebook profile, and I found it too intrusive. I stopped. I'm like, there's no effing way I'm giving you this information in Facebook. And this was 8 years ago. I wasn't even thinking it was going to be that way. I just couldn't get through. I felt personally violated. Meanwhile, everyone else is just, not everyone, but so many people are just happily giving all their stuff to Facebook. It's no, right? But that sense of privacy, right? I want to take my cell phone and wrap it in aluminum foil so I can't be tracked everywhere, right? And I want to use Tor at home on my computer, right? Because I think the sense of privacy is so important, right? That's what the First Amendment is about, actually. It's the privacy to think what you want to think and then express it. So actually, free speech is just an outgrowth of free thought, right? That's the first part of the First Amendment, not not the free speech. You have to have something to think first before you need to say anything, right? Sadly, in class, that often doesn't happen, but hopefully, right, it would happen. And the government, the First Amendment is set up that way to allow that to happen, right? And we're just giving it away. Like, I'm going to have to get off of that effing, fracking Amazon thing, right? Because like now if I open a page, it's like all these things I looked at, they want to sell it to me. Like, I don't want you following me. I think like DuckDuckGo or GoGoDuck or someone is a more useful site. So I'm going to switch to all these sites that are promising me some semblance of privacy, right? But I think part of the problem is we're just going to give away privacy. We don't care. And it's, I don't want to blame 20-year-olds, right? It's like, you grew up in a different era where everyone assumed Facebook and Google and whoever was gathering all our data. So it's just the norm. It's the norm growing up, right? Versus, like, for example, like the smartphone is the way parents surveil their children, right? Like, what the heck? Like, I could get lost in the woods all the time when I was a kid. Bad things happened. Multiple stitches, blood all over the place, right? Bad things, and we had no way to contact anyone. Like, we would then limp out, push broken bikes, bleed all over the place, and show up at someone's house. Yeah, show up at someone's house is total mess, and then hopefully someone would respond in the appropriate manner. But we could be gone forever. Like, I would just come home whenever. Like, summer, like 11 o'clock at night, I'd show up. But no one could call me, no one could contact me, no one could say, come on home now. And now all these kids are used to being surveilled, that their parent can call them at any time and say, hey, time to come home, time to do this, time to be there, right?
But it's also, the surveillance is celebrated and fetishized, right? I mean, it's like, here's what I had for breakfast, and here's how many steps I took today, and here's like what I...
And you border on being an irresponsible parent if you don't give your kid a cell phone, so they can contact you, right? Like if I had little kids now, I would think I'd probably have to give them a smartphone so they can, because it's a safety thing, right, or something. And so, or like for example, in Utah we had this, I think it became national, some parent was letting their kids walk around like to the store. And it's like, what are you doing? How can they walk to the store? It's so dangerous, right? And she says, I'm a free-range parent. I let my kids wander around, right? I used to send my kids to the
contract that you put in the backpack. It's I'm a free-range kid, and it's a full
Jesus.
I don't like that you're describing children like you're a chicken.
Right.
Like you're farming children now.
The thing should be like I used to send my kids to the park and like if you get in a fight, get in a fight. Don't talk to me about it, right? Work it out, figure out what to do, figure out how to live in this world, right? And so, but if you grow up without that sense of like when I mentioned like I only feel like myself in China because I don't have a smartphone, it's because I don't have a smartphone. Like here, if I forget my smartphone, which I do like every other day because I'm old. And it's not Alzheimer's, it's just I'm not used to like, why should I have a smartphone everywhere I go? But it's weird, like if you're going on an 8-hour trip and you forget your phone, you're like, I should go back and get it. Because what happens if my car breaks down? What happened when my car broke down in 1992? Nothing. Like I got the jack out and I changed the tire, right? I was like, what are we talking about? You know, so that sensibility of always being observed and surveilled and then doing self-surveillance, right? Fashion is a huge one that way, right? And then food and all that stuff, right? So you'll grow up with that mindset and so it won't even seem abnormal, right? Like people who are 7 today, none of this will be like abnormal. Sorry, Justin.
Yeah, I just wanted
You're like, I don't want to hear any more about parenting. Can you like get back on topic already? Jesus, why am I here?
No, I just want to add a little more doom and gloom because a lot of this.
Good, I didn't add enough, huh?
Well, I feel like a lot of the surveillance technologies that you're describing, you have to buy into, but unfortunately, a lot of them that we have now, you don't even get to. So you talked about Amazon, which, by the way, you're in the hubbub, right? It's down the street in Alexa.
Yeah, why do you guys live in such an evil place?
I mean, it's so convenient, but
it's so convenient. That's what we were just complaining about.
But right, like you think about, let's talk about the Alexa, which listens all the time, or it's in your Samsung phone and harvests data all of the time, and is now being installed. I don't know if it's in your hotel. You might have one in your hotel room, or it's being installed in new homes right now, or is being installed in Samsung. So it's becoming normalized into the little architecture of the way that homes or apartments or new builds are being constructed, or in cars. So it's being built into the architecture of everyday life. So you don't even have to go and physically sign up. It's being put into the things, or even your cell phone. So there's auditory components as well. Or what about Shot Spotter, right, which they've installed in parts of Seattle? Have you all heard about this? Shot Spotter is another auditory surveillance technology which listens to frequency and it detects for gunshots to distribute resources.
Or like in our parking lot at the University of Utah, they go around with a license plate reader, and every license plate they register. And I can't opt out of that if I have a car, if I take a car.
These are all examples of different surveillance technologies that you don't necessarily even buy into. That are even invading the private home. Shot Spotter, well, auditory becomes difficult, as you know. I have a particular fascination because of what constitutes the private versus the public, but are invading those spaces.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm all down with more doom and gloom, obviously. I said I'm down with more doom and gloom. And yeah, you're right. A lot of this, it's either we can't opt out of it or it's very hard to opt out of, right? Like I'm sure new cars have all sorts of tracking things on them, partly because they want to know, like, and it's not all even just nefarious. That's why a lot of it will be accepted, right? So like they want to understand, or like police always having these digital cam things on all the time, right? Or supposedly, like there's a good purpose for that, but it's also fairly nefarious. Or they want your car to track stuff so they can figure out stuff with accidents or whatever, how fast you were going or whatever. So a lot of surveillance is just there. Yeah, wow. It's making me feel better about being part of a different generation, as Christine said. It's like, not so bad. That was the right time. This is tougher. Sure.
So there's an idea that I've been kind of floating for a while related to this space, and specifically for public figures and people looking at becoming public figures. In this, but I mean, probably extending beyond it, this idea that we have a full surveillance society means that we will be post-privacy, where it's just not an expectation that exists anymore. Right. However, as you, I'm sure, are aware of things like Tor and different forms of encryption, we may not be a post-secrets society. So then there's this question of, do secrets, is the presumption of guilt because you have secrets? And I was wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen quite a bit about, like, the presumption of innocence has been pretty damaged in the last few years. And all sorts of, well, we had an example, like, you're suspicious if you walk around town now. Like, why are you walking in this neighborhood? Oh, people only drive in this neighborhood, right? So if you're walking, so we had actually a former professor at I guess he's retired. So he was pulled over, like, I don't know, 2 miles from my house for walking in the neighborhood, right? And they said, who are you? Why are you walking? He said, I don't need to answer those questions. But of course, he still thinks he has privacy because he's 70, right? And so they arrested him and took him to jail, right? And of course he was let out, but it's basically like, because he's insisting, I don't have to show you my ID, right? I don't have to, like in China, you do have to show your ID. Hoku is your residency card, right? So you belong to this city, that city, et cetera, right? But we don't, right? You're allowed to walk without an ID around the United States, but obviously not really. So this 70-year-old professor who doesn't really look threatening, and even if it did look threatening, who cares, was arrested and taken to jail, right? Because he refused to state his name while walking down the street, right? So yeah, I think presumption of, and right, using Tor, like people have talked about that. If you're using Tor, should the government pay more attention to you because, like egotistical giraffe there, because you're using Tor? Like what are you hiding, right? Instead of just a general sense of privacy. Are you like selling drugs? Are you in some kind of, the dark web stuff or what have you? So yeah, I think it's a huge problem. Sure.
I've got a question kind of on the juxtaposition that you had between Qidong XL protests and then the success of these environmental protests in China, and kind of the idea that it's the wildness of a public that permits both risks to activists and risks to the institution, right? So they kind of yield and they go through with these sort of reforms. But also, like, I feel like you'd ask the question, like, why, or would you expect China to domesticate its public, right? To offer a set of limited protections for the sake of not having to yield to these kinds of measures.
Yeah, it's a good point, right? I mean, I guess you can become a consultant to the Chinese government. Dudes, for a certain amount of money, I'll tell you how to deal with this unrest, which is let them have a certain amount, let them have these certain protections. And I guess I was suggesting a little bit with the idea that environmental issues are a realm of protest that's allowed, right? So it's like, okay, channel your rage at the government over something else. Like the Hoku card, like who wants a residency card where it's hard to move from Shanghai to Beijing? Like really hard, like your job has to sponsor you to get you over there. You can't just be like, hey, I want to move there and I got a job. No, it's like if you're getting a green card in the United States, but you're coming from a different country, so it functions within China that way, right? So difficult stuff. And if you violate, like when they had the one-child policy, if you violated it, it could impact your Hoku card, your mobility, and your job, like all that kind of stuff. So the environment, so there's lots of reasons to be angry, and then the environment was like, okay, first of all, the Chinese government would want things to be cleaner. It's not like they want things to be more polluted. And then it's like, okay, let's channel protest into that. So I think you're right. I think partly what I was saying also with the idea that they watch protests form on social media and see how big they get before they intervene, right? So it's like, yeah, and then people are aware of that, right? Like people are studying that, activists talk about that, so they're aware they have a range of activities that are quote unquote permissible. And then they might cross a line, but in the meantime, they might not cross a line. Like all of us, like when all of us professors talk about revolution, I'm like, what the heck are we talking about? None of us want to lose our jobs. Like look at these revolutions. What happens to intellectuals? They put them in a farm field, which is bad enough, and then they shoot them, right? So it's not, you know, comfort and convenience are big attractions, you know, for humans, for good reasons. Like I'm not criticizing it. Look how comfortable I look, even wearing this jacket, which is a very uncomfortable thing. Christine made me wear this jacket. Can you believe this? I'm like, Christine, I want to wear a shirt. I want to wear a political shirt that's on point and thematic. And she's like, no. Button down and jacket. What do you think we are? We're not so Podunk University. But anyway, yes, I agree. I mean, you're right that if my argument is correct, then the Chinese government would be wise to, they actually do have possibilities of getting permissions for protests and so on. It's just not as vibrant as in the United States. So you could even say to them, hey, make it more vibrant. Let people do this, let people do that. Because then it puts certain bounds where violence, like we hate violence in the United States. If people remember the WTO protests, like the anarchists, and there's a lot of reasons not to like anarchists, it's fine, right? But they have a right to protest and break Starbucks windows. And so, the mermaid of death, come on. Someone has to break their window. But anyway, so the nonviolent protesters were the biggest kind of condemners of the violent protesters in the WTO. They were just furious at them because they're like, you're ruining our protests. We're completely civil, we're completely obedient while protesting, blah, blah, blah. And then you guys are breaking windows. Like, so they actually tried to capture some of them in some of the incidents, right? So when you have a realm where you have accepted civil disobedience that's not particularly threatening, then violence seems really out of bounds. Right? If you're being violent, like, what's wrong with you? Why are you violent? Right? Instead of saying, hey, violence is another form and riskier, and there's more consequences for it, right? And civil disobedience is another form, which also has its own consequences. Like Martin Luther King had consequences. It wasn't like being civilly disobedient had no cost for him. Stabbed, obviously then murdered, but arrested all the time, right? So lots of house firebombed, so lots of severe consequences, depending. I'm just worried that that's devolved so much into ritual. The police know how to handle it. Everyone knows how to handle it. I'll give you an example of this. This is like one of my best protests. This is in Yosemite. And so there's a base jumping protest off of El Capitan. I'll be really not that quick, but pretty quick. And so 5 people were allowed to do it because it's illegal. So people die rock climbing all the time, but they don't want anyone to die base jumping. And so the first person jumping off was like some guy. So he's jumping off, he's pretty peaceful. Second guy jumping off was like a dentist from Ohio who's shouting all these revolutionary base jumping slogans as he landed. And they all agreed to 3 things. One was to get arrested at the end, to get their parachute confiscated, and to pay like a $2,000 fine. Okay, so it's both a protest, but it's pretty domesticated, right? And then the third person, though, who's a very experienced base jumper, she actually jumped to her death. So I was actually standing right next to her husband, and I told him, it's a beautiful death, which it was, right? And I'm kidding, I didn't say that. I wouldn't say that to this guy. This guy is totally traumatized, right? And so I comforted him, and the protest was ruined because there was too much risk all of a sudden. Like someone died protesting. So base jumping is still illegal in Yosemite. This is the protest was at least probably 18 years ago. Base jumping still illegal. So too much risk can ruin a protest, right? Too much violence, right? And so her death ruined it, right? The other two people were supposed to jump, had to hike back down, everything closed, and there's been no more base jumping or even discussion of legal base jumping in Yosemite, right, because of that. But the first two were like too domesticated. It's like, okay, you can arrest me, you can take my parachute, you can fine me $2,000, and I'm good with all that. And what they were protesting actually was an actual wild protest, where this 6 months before, a guy had jumped off of El Capitan and then had to run away from the Forest Service. And as he's running, he jumps into the Merced River. It's spring, and he drowns because he has a parachute on. Right? Like, don't jump in the water with like wedding dresses, parachutes, etc. It's super dangerous. Like, really, people fall into water with a wedding dress and they drown because it's too heavy. So anyway, so that was a true wild protest. He's running from the law, he's chased, and he drowns in the Merced River. Some Mercy River, huh? And then the other one was domesticated, and also failed. But anyway.
So listen, Kevin is going to be visiting my COM 515 class, and a number of you are in that class. If you're not in that class and you would like to join us, please, by all means, I'm ordering some pizzas midway through, 10:30 to 12:20 in COM 242 upstairs. Pizza at 11:15 tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you would like to join us and continue the conversation, please, you're welcome to come. Okay, so thank you so much.
Thanks.